Exposed. CBC accused of silencing media as Carney's story crumbles under conservative pressure. In what many Canadians are calling a stunning case of media hypocrisy, the CBC, Canada's taxpayer-funded public broadcaster, has been accused of actively trying to suppress media coverage of a serious misconduct case involving one of its own senior directors. The controversy erupted after it was revealed in court documents that the CBC attempted to impose a publication ban to prevent journalists from accessing or reporting on the details of a workplace harassment case from 3 years ago. This wasn't a quiet internal review. It involved legal motions to seal the names of those involved and even restrict public access to the courtroom itself. But the Superior Court of Quebec wasn't buying it. The judge overseeing the case firmly rejected CBC's request, pointing out that their rationale was far too vague and failed to demonstrate the kind of concrete harm necessary to override the foundational principle of open court proceedings. For a media organization that has long positioned itself as a defender of transparency and public interest journalism, the CBC's attempt to shield itself from scrutiny struck many as profoundly hypocritical. The court emphasized that CBC's arguments were based on generalities and did not meet the threshold required for such extraordinary secrecy. The individual at the center of the case, referred to in legal filings as Sylvian, was found to have engaged in workplace harassment serious enough to warrant disciplinary action. Yet, the CBC chose to suspend him for just 1 month without pay, an outcome many observers considered shockingly lenient. What's more, the individual remains employed at Radio Canada to this day. That raises serious concerns about whether CBC is truly upholding the very standards it expects others to follow, particularly when it comes to issues of harassment and abuse of power in the workplace. This double standard is not just ironic, it's damaging. CBC has, over the years, taken a strong public stance in similar cases involving other institutions. When allegations emerge elsewhere, the broadcaster has not hesitated to demand accountability, call for resignations, and amplify messages around believing victims and ensuring consequences. But when one of their own faces serious misconduct, the playbook suddenly changes. Instead of championing openness and justice, the institution turns inward, shields its people, and tries to shut down coverage. It's this kind of institutional self-protection that erodes public trust, not just in the CBC, but in all public institutions. When those tasked with holding others accountable are unwilling to hold themselves to the same standard, the credibility of the entire system comes into question. CBC's effort to suppress this story through the courts failed, but the damage to its reputation may already be done. Canadians expect better from their national broadcaster, especially one that operates with the support of public funding. While the CBC story unfolded in the courts, another narrative was building in Parliament, and this one centered on Prime Minister Mark Carney. After his victory in the April 28, 2025 snap election and his rise to Liberal Party leadership, Carney quickly moved to showcase his economic agenda. One of his key promises was to eliminate all federal interprovincial trade barriers by Canada Day. In the days leading up to July 1st, the government announced with great fanfare that it had removed the final 53 federal exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland hailed the move as a major win for Canadian unity and economic growth. The government argued that the elimination of these outdated exceptions, many of which had to do with procurement and redundant certification processes, would streamline commerce across provincial lines and remove inefficiencies that had been in place for decades. The announcement was framed as the fulfillment of a bold Liberal promise, demonstrating federal leadership and commitment to building a stronger internal market. But not everyone was convinced. Conservative MP Damien Carrick was quick to call out the government's framing of the announcement, accusing them of spinning a modest policy move into something far more dramatic than it was. According to Carrick and other critics, the real barriers that prevent free trade within Canada, such as provincial supply management rules, labor licensing restrictions, and provincial pipeline blockades, remain untouched. They argue that while the federal government did clean up some bureaucratic clutter, it hasn't addressed the core issues that fragment Canada's economic landscape. Pierre Poilievre, now leader of the official opposition, echoed this sentiment. In his view, the government was more interested in optics than outcomes, announcing partial changes as if they were comprehensive reforms. This is a criticism that has followed Mark Carney since his time at the Bank of England and later during his campaign for Liberal leadership, that he prefers elegant speeches and symbolic gestures over the gritty, often politically messy work of real reform. The trade announcement may look good in headlines, but Canadians still face real limitations when doing business across provincial borders. Supporters of the Liberals argue that the changes are a step in the right direction and point out that trade within a federation is complicated. They say that by clearing federal hurdles, the government is setting an example and inviting provinces to follow suit. But critics aren't so sure the provinces will act without real federal pressure or incentives. And so, for many voters, Carney's promise of free trade by Canada Day now rings hollow, a slogan detached from the deeper reality of interprovincial dysfunction. Together, these two stories, the CBC's internal cover-up attempt and the federal government's selective trade reform, highlight a recurring problem in Canadian public life: the disconnect between institutional rhetoric and institutional behavior. Whether it's a broadcaster preaching openness while seeking secrecy, or a prime minister celebrating partial progress as historic transformation, the public is left wondering who is truly acting in their interest. The demand for authenticity is rising, and Canadians are becoming increasingly skeptical of polished narratives that don't match the facts on the ground. In both cases, the gap between words and actions is what stands out. The CBC says it stands for truth and transparency, but it acted to block the media from doing its job. The Liberal government says it's eliminating trade barriers, but left the most impactful ones untouched. These aren't just political missteps, they speak to a broader crisis of credibility. Canadians are paying attention, and they're beginning to expect more than speeches, headlines, and photo ops. They want leaders and institutions who walk their talk.